the next half hour than in the next room. I'm Fraser Nelson, editor of The Spectator, and we're here to discuss one of the more difficult subjects of Brexit. It's funny to think that this time last year, various economic warnings were being made. The Treasury was full of people beavering away, detailing all sorts of forecasts and predictions. Not many of them came true, with one exception. The pound did indeed fall, almost as sharply as the Treasury predicted. And while there haven't been that many discernible economic impacts from the Brexit vote, nobody can deny that the currency situation has changed life a lot. Now, hooray, said a lot of the Brexiteers. We're now more competitive, our exporters can sell, and the hotel next door in County Hall will be chock full of tourists coming to spend their money in Britain. But the flip side, of course, is the imports. They'll get significantly more expensive, making life difficult for companies who depend on imports, making life more expensive for the consumers who buy them, pushing up inflation and raising the cost of living. So this is what we're going to discuss at this particular session. We're going to have a sort of a lightning tour through the issues. In what way are the imports being affected? What challenges does this raise to the supply chain? And how manageable is the currency shock? And as Brexit continues, you'll have seen similar warnings of currency weakness and similar turbulence. How troublesome is it? I'm delighted to be joined by three people supremely qualified to talk about this. On my left, we have Lord Wolfson, Chief Executive of Next, which is something like 4 billion sales and suppliers from something like 40 different countries. So he knows a lot about this. Robert Swarnell, the Chairman of Marks and Spencers, who, now my notes here says 617 producers, just 12 in the UK and 20 in the EU. So that is certainly an import conundrum. And then Gerald Mason from Tate & Lyle Sugars. Any of you who've taken the boat ride down this lovely river outside us will have seen a sign saying "Save Our Sugar" outside one of its refineries. Tate & Lyle has been hit more than most by the tariffs of the EU and has got a very different perspective on the challenges which we now face. So, Simon, I'd like to hand over to you first.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everybody who has preferred us over Noel Ferguson. I'm not sure that in your position I would have made the same decision, but thank you anyway. There are, I think, 5 main issues facing those of us who are importers: currency, admin and logistics associated with EU imports, existing trade rules, existing trade deals that Europe has with the rest of the world that we piggyback on, tariffs, and labour. And it's those are the 5 big issues. I should start by saying, broadly, I think that Britain's importers and retailers are well placed to deal with the challenges of Brexit. Starting with currency, although Britain, our currency has devalued by around 15%, certainly within my sector, in terms of how that's translated through into prices, it looks like, as far as we've measured, it's around 4% increase in cost prices that's translated into. And that's largely because when faced with the challenge of increasing prices, you just work much harder to find new sources of supply. Inevitably, your suppliers take some of the pain. And of course, although we've devalued against the dollar and the euro, the currencies in which we're ultimately buying, many of which are developing currencies, have also devalued. Some of them have also devalued against the euro and in particular the dollar. So I don't think it's as big an issue in terms of consumer prices as people initially thought it might be. The other thing that we've got to remember is that it is very much a one-off. There's likely to be a one-off bubble of inflation. And the reality is a country that has been living with an enormous current account deficit, where we've been importing more than we're exporting for years and years and years and years, cannot expect to carry on living that life forever. And it stops this year. It's going to be one difficult year. But as long as we don't go into an inflationary spiral, I think that we will begin to see a return to normality in terms of prices, at least sort of by no later than halfway through 2018. In terms of admin and logistics, this is an area that I don't think, certainly large companies will be unworried by this in terms of the admin and logistics associated with importing their European goods, because we're already dealing with the system for our goods outside the European Union. And the fact is that getting goods into the UK through our customs is not a struggle. getting goods in from Bangladesh. They clear customs in the air, goes through the airport, spends an hour in the airport, and then for those of us who have bonded warehouses, which again is most big retailers, the customs is paid and dealt with when it leaves the warehouse rather than when it leaves the port. The challenge will be one of readiness. Two areas of readiness that are going to be important. Government's readiness to deal with the increased volumes, as all these procedures have to be done on European goods, and also small businesses and businesses that aren't used to importing, dealing with all the new systems. There is a very steep learning curve, but once you're through it, it should be fine. That all the deals the European Union has with countries like Bangladesh, where we have no tariffs, that those deals are grandfathered into the UK system. If they're not, in the case of my company, it would put about 3% on prices if we don't grandfather those deals, the GSP deals, across into our own law. In terms of tariffs, I'm not overly worried about us imposing tariffs on European goods, and that's largely because the company I work for doesn't import a lot from Europe. But for those of people who are importing a lot from Europe, it will be difficult. The only thing I would say is my observation is that where we've seen tariff changes around the world, it's amazing how quickly you can find alternative sources of supply without tariffs. And the other point I'd make, and I'm sure that Tate and I will make this point more strongly, is two things. One is we don't have to impose tariffs on European goods, even if they impose tariffs on our goods. And I would argue that tariffs do much more to damage the country that is imposing them than the one that it is imposed upon. And the second is we've got an enormous opportunity in industries where we have virtually no domestic production to reduce tariffs unilaterally across the board. And clothing and footwear will be a very obvious example of that. The final thing I want to talk about is labour. And I think this is an area where my sector employs a lot of people whose original country wasn't Britain, not necessarily in shops, but certainly in warehouses, and a lot of other sectors more so. And I think here we have a profound question to ask ourselves, and that is, do we believe that people are an asset to an economy or a liability? And to me, there's only one sane answer to that question. People are clearly an asset, and whilst it is essential and important that Britain controls the people who come to this country, and it's important that we make sure that we have the services and infrastructure to deal with any increase in numbers, particularly in areas where you get big increases in people. It is vital that we do not pull up the drawbridge. There is not a limited number of jobs in the UK. The people who are coming here are creating jobs. We have been through a period of record immigration, and we have the lowest levels of unemployment on record since the war. If we are too draconian on immigration, it will have two adverse effects on our economy. The first is it will undermine all of our quality of life and undermine our economic growth. And the second is it will send the worst of all possible signals to the rest of the world. Because the most important thing to come out of Brexit is that we come out and we send a very clear message to the rest of the world. And that message is that Britain is an open country, a free trading country, one that embraces the rest of the world and doesn't reject it.
Thank you.
Follow that, if you will. That was a tour de force, and you would imagine that pretty much all of those subjects are ones that I would cover. We probably can't talk about the effect on prices because we'd probably all be sent to prison, so I'll avoid that. There is one fundamental difference between Simon's business and ours, and that is that half of our business is food. If you take the two halves of our business, clothing and home, 3% of our imports come from the EU. In food, it's 20% of our 20% of what we sell comes from the EU. And in food, 65% comes from the UK, and in clothing and home, 90-something% comes from countries other than the EU. Now, food, although you may talk about substitutability, if I tell you that 60% of our wine, unsurprisingly, comes from the EU, there are many people who would say that French wine isn't necessarily substituted by Australian wine. And in fact, in many areas, substitution, I think, would be quite problematical. So what happens to food tariffs, which, by the way, go from anywhere from 22% to 35%? on tariffs currently into the EU is really of profound importance to what happens to consumers in the UK. And by the way, the EU's stance on tariffs on food is really pretty fundamentally different to its stance on clothing. So I think this is a big area and a real area that the government has to focus on to ensure that we get tariff-free or free trade in food. And I think that's going to be a big issue.
It could be unilateral.
It could be unilateral, absolutely. Well, except that we would be importing. It could be unilateral, precisely. But nonetheless, politically, that would be quite a tough thing to do. On the clothing and home, again, the point on the general system of preferences, or the Bangladeshis, the Cambodias, absolutely fundamental that those remain in place and that we don't have a change there. That would be a profound effect. And just on labour, I would just emphasise that in the food supply chain, that is a huge area where foreign labour, and really good foreign labour, has been a fundamental part of the supply chain. So it's something that we're very concerned about. Of the other areas that you mentioned, I think I would only just talk a little bit about frictionless customs. And again, the prospect, if the admin, particularly on food in Europe, and again, customs on food tend to be more complicated than customs on clothing. If that isn't adequately dealt with, you're talking about potentially an 8 to 10% increase in cost from non-frictionless customs. So there are some really big areas, and actually I would highlight food a great deal more than I would the clothing and home, which I think is an easier one. On the currency effect, I would actually fundamentally agree with what Simon says. It is a big thing. It's a huge number if you look at both of our businesses and just take the gross number. But in the end, through a combination of efficiencies in our supply chain, efficiencies in our own business, I suspect the consumer is going to see a relatively little part of it. And that would be our intention.
I'll try and be a bit quick because I think both Simon and Robert have covered a lot of ground. We trade 8 times more with the rest of the world than we do with the EU 27. So it's probably no surprise that we're really excited about Britain getting back control over its own trade policy. We've really struggled with Europe's trade policy and been part of that over the years. What we found is that Europe's trade policy is a real mishmash of an average of what 28 member states want offensively and defensively. And of course, because there aren't many other countries that care about cane sugar, that's meant that we face around 100% tariff on cane sugar as the raw material for our factory in East London, if we want to buy from around 95% of the supply in the world that could supply us. So that's forced our costs up. And when we pay these tariffs, we send them to Brussels, and Brussels, in its own unique way, sent that money back out to subsidise our competitors, beet sugar farmers around Europe. So it's no surprise that we're quite excited, I think, about a future where the trade policy is determined in the UK. But even for us, there'll be challenges. I mean, it's wrong to say there won't. Raw cane sugar is by far the single biggest cost in our business, 60 to 80% of our costs. But we also buy other things, around 1,500 other goods and services for the factories in the UK. Paper's the example I often talk about, the paper that we make the sugar bags from. Around a third of that we source from Europe. So we're busy trying to look at all of those different products that we purchase, trying to rank them in terms of spend and risk to the business. And what's really interesting for me is that it's made us look afresh at where we buy things and who we trade with. I'm not saying our purchasing team are lazy, but it does make you take a fundamental look at where you're buying things from and why you buy it. So, with our paper as an example, the paper that we buy from Italy and the Czech Republic and all those different places at the moment, it may be a challenge for us to change that supply chain, but it could be an opportunity for somebody in the UK. And then just finally, on customs processes, I think it's a really important really important point. You know, we're the biggest importer in Europe of probably the most protected product in Europe. So it's no surprise to you that getting stuff through customs is really, really tough. But even for us, we did some maths on it because it's a recurring question. Even for us, the cost of the customs process is around 0.01 to 0.06% of the value of the product that we're bringing through customs. So, you know, I'm with Simon on this. You know, it is just a process. Everybody, of course, who doesn't do it at the moment will be afraid of the change, quite rightly so. But once you get the process right, it's not so scary as people think. So we're really excited. I get the fact that lots of companies aren't for different reasons, but you know, I think it's important that people like us who see as much opportunity as challenge, you know, talk about it as well.
Okay, well, I'm going to quickly ask some questions, and then you guys can think of some too. Simon, I was struck by two things that you were saying. One was basically, if costs go up, a good retailer doubles down and makes sure they're not passed on to consumers. Surely it can't be that easy. I mean, surely you're always trying to get costs down. I mean, I don't quite see how you can magic up some cost savings that take away from the significant increases you'll get in the form of currency.
It is a very good question, and it's a question I've asked myself, you know, of bias. I think one of the things that does happen is that people take risks that they wouldn't otherwise take. So, for example, switching a supplier in clothing is always risky. You know, if you go to a new supplier, you haven't used them before, or you haven't used them in volume before, then although they're cheap, there's always a risk they won't deliver on time, they might not make them goods to quality and all the rest of it. When you get an economic shock, like a 15% devaluation of the currency, those risks are worth taking. And I think if I have to look at anything more than anything else, it's the moving of suppliers and also moving of countries even to get better prices, where people, when times are good, are a little bit comfortable with their existing supplier base and see all the virtues of it. And when times get tough, they're prepared to take the risks of new and different sources of supply.
I'd agree with that, and consolidating suppliers. The one thing that I think a board has got to be really on the lookout for, though, is any shortcuts in the standards in the supply chain. And I can tell you the M&S board, as a result of the fact that we know that we're going to be under pressure to perform in this area, is much more vigilant about what's happening in our supply chain and are we doing the right thing. I think that's an area people do need to watch.
And Robert, you're saying 97% of M&S clothes comes from overseas. So the cost, I mean, how come we're not going to be seeing a 5% increase in your clothes right now?
I think the reason that his share price and my share price have gone down as they have over the next period of time is that we are taking a hit to our profits that we wouldn't otherwise have taken. I don't think there's any doubting that.
Right, but roughly speaking, how much of this cost is being passed on to consumers, M&S consumers?
Well, I'm being a bit edgy about that.
We've been public about it, so I can say we've published it. What we've said is our prices have gone up by around 4%. Underlying prices have gone up about 5%. Input cost prices have gone up by 5%. And that compares to local currency devaluations in final currency around 10%. So we've managed to absorb half it, and then we've subsidised 1% of that, so it's gone down to 4%.
And you suffering turnover pressures as a result?
It's difficult to know because no one tells you why they haven't bought something, and you know, clothing's not super easy at the moment anyway. Our guess is that there's about 1.1 elasticity, so that if you put the prices up 4%, you would expect around a 0.5% hit to cash sales.
Right. And remember that a lot of this hasn't fed through yet because most of us were hedged to a greater or lesser extent. So this is still to come. But you know, the effect, the gross effect, undealt with, we're talking hundreds of millions of pounds.
Right. And Gerald, I think you said during the EU referendum
Or just on currency.
Sure. And Gerald, I remember you saying during campaign, Gerald, you were one of the very few businessmen to actually speak up in favour of Brexit. And you came up with a figure there which really stuck with me, that the EU forced your costs up by something like 40 million euros, turning what ought to have been a profitable business into one which made a 25 million euro loss. So getting release from those tariffs could be transformative to your business and to the prices that your consumers pay?
Yeah, and I think it's understanding that I can understand why the short-term focus is on this currency effect, but I think, it would be really good if we all talk more as well about, what the opportunity is in the medium to long term, the structural change that we can make on tariffs and costs to consumers on some of these products where, we're not going to have an effect on the domestic sector because there simply isn't one, or there's not one that can supply the whole demand. So for us, yeah, it's going to be transformational, and I think it would be really good to hear more from businesses, not just focusing on the short-term cost impact of currency, but what are the opportunities in the medium to long term to make structural changes that may not have been right for the average EU 28 consumer, but will be for the UK consumer.
Okay. I'd be interested to see what Simon and Robert think of that too. I mean, what are the upsides for your businesses on tariff reform? And given that Britain will have a chance to set its own trade policy, do you suffer much from tariffs right now? Do you see much upside to this?
Yeah, I mean, basically it's 12% from most countries. So, and there is no reason why Britain should have tariffs on clothing and footwear. We have such a small domestic market. So from Robert's numbers, that it's of no benefit to us. It's there to protect Spanish and Italian and Portuguese manufacturers. These tariffs. So there is an enormous potential upside in our sector. And I think actually one of the speakers this morning said, actually the whole sort of non-farm produce sector, there's an enormous opportunity to reduce costs for the UK consumer.
I mean, there was a few you would have heard from this, is that I don't think any of us are sitting here in a state of sort of shock about this. I mean, yes, there's an effect, there's a currency effect that we've talked about, but we will, I mean, there's certainly a tariff opportunity. I mean, it's 12 to 17% on footwear. There's a real opportunity there. So, once that currency aspect has been dealt with, we can see some real opportunities. So, as long as we don't have aberrational effects, particularly on food, where we shoot ourselves in the foot by whatever arrangement we put in place, because that would be a real effect for the consumer.
And Simon, you picked up on something Robert said earlier about we could have unilaterally abolish tariffs. Robert replied, that will be politically difficult. Now, you are a member of Parliament as well as a chief executive. Surely the notion of unilateral tariffs exists only in the fantasy of Ayn Rand free traders, and politically there is no way that the British government is going to have unilateral tariffs.
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, if under GATT and WTO you set a tariff level, you always are going to risk that you have to set it for everybody that you haven't got an agreement with. There are countries at the moment that have higher tariffs on our goods than we have on theirs. Right. So that aberration already exists where we have certain tariffs on in particular, say, relation to, say, South America.
So there's no reason why we couldn't just say to the EU, we're not going to charge tariffs on your imports, even if you charge tariffs on ours?
I think particularly in sectors where we import very little from Europe anyway, and they import very little from us.
Anybody got any questions?
Could I just counsel that doesn't apply to food, where actually we do import quite a lot. I mean, it certainly applies to clothing and footwear, where, as I said, 3% of our imports come from the EU.
Okay, but as a gentleman, we have got not very long to a few minutes for questions. So.
Hi, thanks. James Ashton. Just interested on the assumption is that there is no clothing and footwear industry, and is there any in the UK? Is there any, given that today is all about thinking differently, the future and so on, if the UK doesn't get the tariffs settlement that it wants, is there a renaissance here for domestic textiles, clothing, footwear? And then the second point, Simon in particular, I think you said of your 5 points, you said that because you were a big company, there were at least a couple of them that you could deal with more easily. I'm just interested in the perspective. Do you see how SME importers will cope? What do they have to do differently?
I mean, on the SME front, a lot of them, if they're already importing from outside the European Union, then all they've got to do is do exactly what they're doing for their non-EU imports. They've got to do the same rigmarole for their EU imports. And actually, it's not too burdensome. It's more the problem there is more one of capacity. The people who are going to struggle are the relatively small number of people who are only importing from the EU. and they're going to have to learn the system from scratch. And if the government were to be able to put together workshops for those people, it would make an enormous difference, I think, for the relatively small part of our economy. It's not that there's no, in terms of the other thing, clothing and footwear industry, there is some clothing and footwear produced in the UK, but you can tell from Robert's number, he said 97%. And I think we have to take a view that, the thing about tariffs is that actually it comes down to that sort of terrible political phenomena where for the sort of significant benefit of a small number, everybody else pays a small cost. But that small cost, when you add it up, adds up to far more than the benefit to those who benefit from the protectionism. And people will shout very loudly when they are protected and not shout very loudly when they're a consumer that just doesn't know that they could be getting their goods cheaper. And we have to embrace the ethos of free trade, which says that actually, no, free trade is good and it's good for the whole country. And as much as you might be protecting, one industry, that same person working in that same job is paying more for everything that they buy if we go for a protectionist solution. So we have to embrace free trade and believe in it. And if we do that, we'll be successful. No, not necessarily. I mean, we're looking at actually at paper at the moment, printing. We're looking at we currently do that on the continent. Maybe it's something we should do here. With the devaluation and the risk of tariffs, maybe we should look at that here. But not the very low skill jobs that can be done much, much better in China.
No, I'd echo that. In fact, it's 4% of our clothing is in the UK, but it's small and it's a lot of lingerie. And if we had an opportunity to do it, I can tell you we would. So we are pretty eagle-eyed on whether there is an opportunity, and certainly at the high end there is some, but it's likely to be limited. And tariffs isn't the answer to the renaissance.
Thanks. Phil Rush from Heteronomics. So there's some evidence in the inflation data that there's been a bit of front-loading in terms of the pass-through from devaluation. And surveys like the one by the Bank of England agents suggest that there is some willingness to pass through that devaluation hit a bit quicker than was the case back in 2008. And is that something that you would agree with from your own business's perspective? And also, to what extent can you say whether you've passed through things with the normal Feb, March seasonals, or how much is left to come through?
Yeah, we've actually sort of published information on this, and you can look in our, we've been very specific about it. The truth is that, although Robert and I are obviously great friends, we were in an extremely competitive industry, and anyone who thinks that they should pass through price rises before they absolutely have to in our industry would be making an enormous mistake. And you can see that in the gross margins of the businesses that report. If you look at net margins, that will tell you whether people have been profiteering or not. And virtually across our sector, last year net margins went down. So I don't think that's happened. The devaluation happened in June. Most of the price effects you will have seen only from January this year. But certainly in a very competitive, low barrier to entry market, you don't want to put your prices up unless you absolutely have to.
Find a more competitive industry, let me know about it. I suppose food retailing, but it's very competitive.
Jonathan Nisby from Brexit Central. This is probably for Robert, really, in terms of the food. Last year I spoke to someone from a food retailer who was aghast that we're going to be leaving the Common Agricultural Policy because this is going to mean that all kinds of cheap food is going to be imported from outside the EU, which struck me as being rather a good thing for the consumer. Would you agree?
Well, I think in the end we've got to, I'm not sure that I've got the information to answer that adequately. All I would say is that we don't tend to take decisions like that on a spot basis. I mean, we've been supporting UK farmers for dozens of years, and we're not suddenly going to switch from one place to another because there's a spot price there that's different from a spot price here. So we tend to run our business, particularly in the agricultural bit, on a long-term basis. So I don't think you're going to see people switch like a rocket. Yeah.
I think it's a really good question, Jonathan, and I've sort of seen the same throughout the food and drink sector. And my take on it is I think that more than anything, the sector's afraid of change. You know, that we've got supply chains, massive tariffs on food and drink around Europe, so supply chains focused in and around Europe where they can. And I think a lot of businesses are really afraid, and, you know, the status quo is what everybody in the food and drink sector, is the sense that I would prefer, because they're nervous about, you know, the significant disruption that's potentially there to not just prices, but the supply chains that are all deeply embedded and ingrained. So that's my sense, you know, that there has been a real fear of change in the food and drink sector, the food and manufacturing sector. I don't know so much about the retail sector, but my sense is that's because it's easier to see we might have to change than it is necessarily to see in 5 to 10 years' time you might be able to do something differently which brings value to your customer. So that's my take on it, and I think people are slowly beginning to realise there will be change and having to sort of accept that, you know, they're going to have to do things differently. Supply chains will change, you know, value chains will change, and start to think not just about the short-term shock, but what the long-term gain might be and how you get a competitive edge on your competitors in the sector.
Okay, final question at the back there, and this.
Michael Savage from The Observer. Just a quick one for Lord Wolfson. You talk about not pulling up the drawbridge, but there's pulling up the drawbridge and pulling up the drawbridge. I just wondered, in terms of numbers, obviously the Prime Minister's talk about a big reduction, particularly in sort of low-skilled labour. So would you see end of free movement, but similar numbers? What, more specifically, what do you see a future for sort of low-skilled labour here?
I think it's a mistake to talk about numbers. Ultimately, no one is omniscient enough to know exactly what level of labour migration to the UK is going to be beneficial to us. And my view is that rather than having arbitrary numbers control the amount of people that come here, we should have a demand-led system where we basically look at people who are coming to fill vacancies. And if people have got a job to come to, then that is ultimately the measure of whether they are needed by our economy or not. But I think any form of arbitrary number is dangerous and a mistake. The chances are it's going to be one of two things. It'll either be too high or too low.